I talked about Jane Austen and her connection to the Cotswolds and the Dashwood family in my last video. And today I want to talk about her and her time in Bath. She visited in her early 20s, lived in Bath in her late 20s. This was during the time of Bath's decline as being one of the most fashionable places to go in England. And it was one of the most fashionable places. Between 1750 and 1800, if you had money, you would go to Bath in the winter. Villages were not only cold during the winter, but without electricity and very short daylight hours. People would go to cities like Bath if they could for social connections, entertainment, evening light, warmth, excitement. And those who stayed for a few weeks or a few months would attend balls and leave calling cards for mutual social visits. So Jane moved to Bath at age of 26 with her family, and she lived there until she was 31. After the death of her father, forced her family to move again. And besides some time that she spent in Southampton, which is a small city, and a few visits to London, Bath was really her only immersive experience with city living. One way to see Bath is from Beechen, which is just south of the city. Alexandra Park was built there after Jane's time, but the walk up the cliff is very similar today as it was in her time, and it was a walk that she did a lot. You get to the top, you could look down onto the city. Jane uses this spot, Beechen Cliff, as a place where Henry and Katharine walk to in her book, Northanger Abbey. You can see all of the city from this spot. And here I've taken some photos with the telephoto lens, and zooming in here we can see a few different places around the city. On the right, on this view, is Bath Abbey. That's the cathedral in the center of town. And to the left of it, there's a dome, and that's the top of the Roman baths. The Roman baths were discovered in the late 1800s, a bit after Jane left. Well, I wanted to share 3 stories today. One of the stories is from the corner of Stall Street and Bath Street, which is right by the Roman baths. Another story is from Queen Square. This is Queen Square here. Just up from Queen Square, just up the hill, is the Jane Austen Center, and you can see where you can just about make out the purple sign from the Jane Austen Center, and there's a statue of Jane outside. Jane didn't write much in the years that she lived in Bath, but she was a constant walker and walked all over the city and the surrounding areas, and Bath figures prominently in 2 of her novels. I believe it's mentioned in all of them, but it figures prominently in 2, with a youthful excitement in Northanger Abbey, and with a bit of a sort of older, more critical perspective on the city in the book Persuasion. Overall, it is said that she wasn't a big fan of the city. In her books, the country villages are where beauty and honesty live, and the cities are places where deceptive men go to hide, with scenes of chaotic and superficial social events. The bawling of newsmen, muffin men and milkmen, and the ceaseless clink of patent shoes. This is a rare view of one of her manuscripts when it was on display at the Bodleian Library in Oxford in the spring of 2024. It's from chapter 4 of a book called The Watsons, which is a novel she started but then abandoned. But she was writing it while she was in Bath, between 1803 and 1805. It says, "You should wear half boots." After another pause, "Nothing sets off a neat ankle more than a half boot. Nankeen, galoshed with black, looks very well. Do you not like half boots?" "Yes, but they are so stout as to injure their beauty. They're not fit for country walking. Ladies should ride in dirty weather. Do you ride?" "No, my lord." "I wonder every lady does not. A woman never looks better than on horseback." Well, anyway, yeah, so she wrote those words while living in Bath. And Bath is just, it's a beautiful city. It's the city we see today was almost entirely built during that period, the Georgian period, the late 1700s, making it such a unique experience to walk around today. Of course, the city was originally a Roman town, but interestingly, none of the Roman buildings were known to Jane, as they were only excavated in the late 1800s. I owe a lot to Katharine Reeves and her 2006 book, Jane Austen in Bath, Walking Tours of the Writer's City. Also Jane Freeman in her 1969 book, also called Jane Austen in Bath. Jane Austen and Bath, there's a lot has been published. We've got a map of Bath in Jane Austen's time, and we've got Jane Freeman's book and Katharine Reeves' book. Well, let's look around Bath and stop at some of the places that Jane knew and find a couple of stories from her life. I mean, she was a vivacious walker, as I mentioned, and she walked these same paths many times in her 20s. The first story I want to share is from Queen Square. When Jane was 23, her brother was ill, and he came to Bath to what they called take the cure, to drink the waters. He rented a house at number 13 and invited Jane and her mother to stay with him, which they did in May 1799. They arrived early in the afternoon, and when they got there, Jane sat down at once in the drawing room to write a letter to her sister Cassandra. Now, number 13 is a private house on the corner of Queen Square, but right next door is a hotel, and the view from the window in the hotel is about as close, I think, to the view that Jane would have seen as she was writing the letter as we can get to today. So this is the house here, and I'll quote a little bit of the letter that she was writing and show you what the view onto the square looks like. My dearest Cassandra, our journey yesterday went off exceedingly well. Nothing occurred to alarm or delay us. We found the roads in excellent order, had very good horses all night. Last night, stopping along the way, we had asparagus and a lobster, which made me wish for you, and some cheesecakes. Well, here we are at Bath. We got here about 1 o'clock and have arrived just long enough to go over the house, fix our rooms, and be very well pleased with the whole of it. It's rained almost all the way, and our first view of Bath has been just as gloomy as it was last November. A little black kitten runs about the staircase. It is settled for us to be above, where we have 2 very nice-sized rooms with dirty quilts and everything comfortable. I have the outward and larger apartment, as I ought to have, which is quite as large as our bedroom at home, and my mother's is not materially less. I hope it will be a tolerable afternoon. When we first came, all the umbrellas were up, but now the pavements are getting very white again. There's a very long list of arrivals here in the newspaper yesterday so that we need not immediately dread absolute solitude, and there is a public breakfast in Sydney Gardens every morning so that we shall not be wholly starved. The prospect from the drawing room window at which I now write is rather picturesque, as it commands a perspective view of the left side of Brock Street broken by 3 Lombardy poplars in the garden of the last house in Queen's Parade. Yours very affectionately, Jane. Well, the second story I wanted to share is from about 3 months later after they had left Bath. It is a story about Jane's wealthy aunt and uncle on her mother's side, James and Jane Lee Perrot. They were childless and lived at number 1 Paragon. Jane and her family had stayed with them a year or 2 earlier. It's an elegant 4-story house that looks much the same today as it did in their time, though the windows are full panes today, whereas they would have been small glass squares back then. Well, the story is on a Thursday morning in August. They walked from the Paragon to Haberdasher on the corner of Bath Street and Stall Street, known as Smith's. Mrs. Lee Perrot bought a spool of lace from the woman working behind the counter, who was part of a family that owned the store. A bit later, after they had left, they were passing the store again, and the woman ran out of the shop accusing her of stealing some white lace. Mrs. Lee Perrot opened the bag, found both black and white lace. She said it must have accidentally been put there, and she returned it. Obviously, she didn't steal it. The allegation just doesn't make any sense. least of all why a wealthy woman would steal a little bit of lace. But 10 days later, after being accused of theft, she was put in jail. But at that time, no bail was allowed for these types of crimes, and her court date was set 8 months in the future. And if she was convicted, the sentence could be up to 14 years of deportation. So the jailer had helped her and her husband, and by lodging them in a corner of his own house. Jane's mother offered to send Jane and her sister to support her in jail and in court, to which Mrs. Lee Perot responded, "To have two young creatures gazed at in public court would cut me to the very heart." Well, needless to say, she was acquitted of the crime. The notes of the trial, which Jane would have eagerly and likely read as they were published by Mr. Crosby in Bath, the same publisher who she sold the rights to what became Northanger Abbey, although she later bought the rights back from him. And it's thought that the haberdasher was either looking to find retribution with Mrs. Lee Perot, and there are some accounts as well that she was not particularly pleasant, but at least Jane didn't like her very much. She found her manipulative. Or perhaps the haberdasher was just simply trying to extort her wealthy husband. I mean, that was just part of life back then. Anybody could accuse you of any small crime, and you might sit in jail for 6 months waiting for a trial and waiting to be acquitted. Well, anyway, Jane and her family moved to Bath a couple years later, so they, I suppose, couldn't have been too disillusioned with the whole event. And finally, they moved into 4 Sydney Place, which is right across from the Sydney Gardens. The gardens are still there today, and the tea house and tavern that led into the garden in Jane's time is still there today. It's called the Holborn Museum. When Jane lived there from 1801 to 1804, the big news was the building and opening of the Kennet and Avon Canal that runs through the north side of the gardens. In exchange for letting them run the canal through the Sydney Gardens, the canal company had to build 2 iron footbridges that opened in 1800, and those bridges are still there today. Jane would have walked on these and would have talked about them and the news about the opening of the canal. So if you go into Sydney Gardens through the Holborn Museum, the 2 bridges are at the far end of the garden, the north side. I've been to Bath a few times, usually during the Christmas market in December. These photos are from a trip I took in the spring of 2024. Well, thank you to Katharine Reeves, Jean Freeman, both of who wrote books on Jane Austen in Bath. In my last video, I talked about Jane Austen's influences from the people and families nearby in the Cotswolds. In the next video, we're going to go forward about 170 years to another writer whose work you almost certainly know, but you might not know that it was inspired by the city of Bath. See you then.